Brussels did not see it coming, not because the warning signs were absent, not because the polling data had been hidden or the political signals had been unclear. Brussels did not see it coming because the European Union had spent 70 years building an institutional culture that was architecturally incapable of processing the specific category of threat that arrived when Elon Musk posted 3 words and 500 million people stopped what they were doing and read them. The man who owns the platform where the world thinks out loud, who controls the satellites providing internet to the hospitals and farms and emergency services of an entire continent, who sits inside the most powerful government on earth with direct access to decisions that shape the global order, looked at the European Union and said it should cease to exist. And the most alarming thing that happened next was not the fury from Brussels. It was the silence from European living rooms. Because a significant portion of the people the EU governs did not rush to defend it. They read those 3 words and they felt something that European institutions had spent years telling themselves their citizens did not feel: recognition. This is not a story about platform regulation or digital compliance deadlines or the legal mechanics of the Digital Services Act. This is a story about whether the political order that has governed 500 million people since the rubble of the Second World War can survive a legitimacy crisis that no regulation can fix, no fine can reverse, and no emergency summit can talk its way out of. And it is happening right now in real time, faster than Brussels can respond. The European Union was not built on bureaucracy. That is what its critics have always missed and what its defenders have always forgotten to say loudly enough. It was built on a specific and devastating lesson that the European continent had purchased at a price measured in tens of millions of lives across 2 world wars within a single generation. The leaders who constructed the foundational architecture of European integration in the years following 1945 were not idealists disconnected from political reality. They were realists who had lived through what European nationalism at its maximum destructive capacity actually produced when it was given state power, industrial resources, and military organization. Their founding logic was not sentimental. It was structural. Bind the economies of European nations together deeply enough that the material cost of conflict between them becomes impossible to absorb. Create shared institutions that give governments mechanisms for resolving disputes that do not require mobilizing armies. Build a legal framework that operates across borders and makes the kind of sovereign unilateralism that had produced catastrophe a structurally more difficult choice than negotiation. For decades, the logic produced results visible enough to sustain the project's legitimacy. Europe experienced the longest uninterrupted period of peace in its recorded history. Economies grew at rates that transformed populations emerging from wartime destruction and poverty into the most prosperous societies in human history. Borders opened in ways that created a generation whose sense of identity was genuinely continental. The project worked well enough and long enough to become the background assumption of European life rather than an active political choice that each generation renewed through conscious engagement with what it was and what it required. That shift from active choice to background assumption was the beginning of a vulnerability that took decades to fully develop, but that was accumulating beneath the surface of European institutional confidence throughout the period when everything appeared to be functioning as designed. The EU expanded from 6 founding nations to 27 member states across a geographic and cultural span that introduced complexity the original institutional architecture had not been built to manage without costs that became increasingly visible as the expansion proceeded. The institutions in Brussels grew larger and slower and more distant from the daily lives of the people whose affairs they were increasingly shaping. The regulatory output of European governance expanded in volume and reach across every domain of economic and social life in ways that ordinary citizens experienced not as the delivery of shared benefits, but as the imposition of constraints whose connection to their own expressed preferences was impossible to trace through the layers of institutional process separating Commission decisions from democratic mandates. Citizens began experiencing Brussels not as something operating with them, but as something operating over them. a governing machine whose authority derived from treaties signed by governments rather than from the ongoing consent of the populations those governments represented. The 2008 financial crisis cracked the surface in ways that never fully healed. When the global financial system collapsed and the response constructed by European institutions around the most severely affected economies imposed austerity measures whose human consequences were immediate and devastating, the political resentment generated was not the ordinary dissatisfaction that democratic systems routinely absorb and process through electoral cycles. It was the deeper and more durable resentment of populations who had watched unelected technocrats make decisions about their employment, their public services, their children's futures from behind institutional walls that provided no meaningful mechanism for democratic accountability or electoral reversal. Unemployment in Greece surpassed 27%. Youth unemployment in Spain climbed above 50%. Entire generations watched the economic futures they had built their lives around disappear, while officials in Brussels and Frankfurt explained the necessity of structural adjustment in language that bore no recognizable relationship to the human reality those adjustments were producing. The resentment went underground when the immediate crisis passed. It did not disappear. It waited with the patient consistency of something that has found its cause and is simply waiting for its moment. Brexit in 2016 was the first major surfacing. A significant portion of a major European nation had concluded through a direct democratic exercise that the costs of EU membership in terms of sovereignty, democratic accountability, and political self-determination exceeded the benefits. Brussels had processed this as an isolated event driven by specifically British political pathologies rather than as a symptomatic expression of tensions building across the continent. The populist movements rising simultaneously in Hungary, Poland, Italy, France, and the Netherlands, while Brussels was insisting on Brexit's isolation, made the insistence analytically unsustainable to anyone willing to look at the evidence rather than the institutional narrative. Into this landscape Musk arrived, not as a politician seeking power through electoral competition, not as a diplomat representing a government's interests through established channels. As the owner of the platform where global public discourse happened in real time, the operator of satellite infrastructure that had become load-bearing for European connectivity in ways that no government had planned or authorized, and increasingly as the most visible and most consequential critic of the regulatory order that European institutions had been constructing around the digital economy for years. His acquisition of Twitter and its transformation into X had been a declaration whose significance extended far beyond the commercial transaction it also was. He believed the world's digital public square had been captured by ideological gatekeepers making decisions about what hundreds of millions of people were permitted to see and say based on political preferences those gatekeepers had never been required to disclose or defend in any democratic process. He dismantled the content moderation infrastructure whose decisions had generated the most politically contentious outcomes. He released internal communications documenting the processes through which government agencies in multiple countries had been requesting that the platform suppress specific speech and specific accounts. He positioned himself as the primary institutional resistance between ordinary citizens and the architecture of digital control he argued had been constructed without public awareness or democratic consent. For millions of Europeans who had experienced the previous moderation regime as systematic suppression of political views diverging from the institutional mainstream, this made Musk a symbol of something the EU had always claimed to represent, but had, in their experience, consistently failed to deliver. Genuine freedom of expression without gatekeeping by people who had decided in advance which expressions were acceptable. The European Commission's Digital Services Act was the most ambitious regulatory intervention any democratic jurisdiction had attempted in the domain of digital platform governance. Its architects had spent years navigating the full complexity of the EU's legislative machinery to produce a framework whose scope and ambition reflected the Commission's conviction that the digital spaces where European citizens spent increasing portions of their cognitive and political lives had been allowed to develop without the accountability mechanisms that any other domain of comparable social influence would have been required to operate under from the beginning. The act designated the largest platforms as very large online platforms subject to obligations that went considerably beyond the content moderation requirements that previous regulatory frameworks had imposed. They were required to conduct and publish risk assessments of how their algorithmic systems shape the information environment experienced by their users. They were required to submit to independent audits whose findings could form the basis of enforcement action. They were required to provide researchers with data access that would make the previously opaque processes through which platforms shaped public discourse visible to external scrutiny. They faced financial penalties of up to 6% of their global annual revenue for sustained non-compliance, a figure calibrated to be painful enough to compel behavioral change from companies whose revenues were large enough to absorb smaller fines as operational costs. For the officials who had designed the legislation and shepherded it through the years of institutional process required to produce it, the act represented exactly what democratic governance of powerful private infrastructure was supposed to look like: systematic, legally grounded, institutionally accountable regulation of entities whose influence over public life had grown to rival that of governments, while operating under no comparable obligation to justify their decisions or submit to democratic oversight. For Musk, it represented something whose character he described with the directness that had become the defining feature of his public communication style. Institutionalized censorship constructed with sufficient legal sophistication to make the censorship difficult to challenge directly, but censorship nonetheless in its practical operation and in the political intentions of the people who had designed it. The enforcement dynamic that developed through 2024 and into 2025 was unlike anything the Commission's regulatory architecture had been designed to manage, because it assumed that the entities subject to its authority would respond to regulatory pressure through the conventional channels of corporate legal representation and compliance negotiation that previous tech platform confrontations with European regulators had followed. Musk did not use those channels. He used the one he owned. Every formal regulatory action the Commission initiated against X became within hours the subject of posts reaching hundreds of millions of users across Europe, framing the action in terms that the Commission had no comparable platform to contest at equivalent speed or scale. When the Commission announced an investigation, Musk's users saw it as confirmation of the Brussels machine's fear of free speech. When the Commission issued compliance demands, his audience received them as evidence of an institution that had decided the only speech it would permit was speech that did not threaten its authority. When commissioners made public statements defending the regulatory process, he mocked them by name to an audience that dwarfed anything European institutional communications could reach through any channel available to them. The asymmetry was structural, and it was not going to be resolved by the Commission becoming better at social media. The communications infrastructure of European democratic institutions had been built around a media environment that no longer existed in the form that had made it adequate. It assumed that official statements would be processed through journalistic intermediaries who would apply the editorial standards and contextual framing that gave institutional communications their authority. It assumed that the primary arena of public discourse was one in which institutional actors had established presence and established credibility. Musk had built a different arena, operated it under different rules, and had 200 million reasons every time he posted to know that the arena he had built was where the audience actually was. He did not stop at criticizing specific policies or challenging specific enforcement decisions. He moved to the foundational question that the Commission had always relied on the complexity of its own processes to keep out of the direct public discourse where it was most politically dangerous. He argued that the European Union had become an unelected supranational government, imposing binding obligations on sovereign nations and their citizens through processes that provided no meaningful mechanism for democratic accountability or electoral reversal. He called it a failed experiment in bureaucratic overreach. He said Europe would be stronger and freer and more genuinely democratic without it. He said the EU should be abolished. The Commission's public response was immediate and deployed the full register of institutional condemnation, whose language reflected the genuine severity with which senior officials were assessing what had just occurred. Dangerous, irresponsible, A deliberate attempt to destabilize European democracy by a foreign actor operating through a platform with legal obligations under European law that he was systematically refusing to honor. One senior official used language that had no precedent in the Commission's public communications, describing Musk's post